So I recently read Kyle Chayka's book, Filterworld, How Algorithms Flatten Culture, which is something that's been getting a lot of attention lately within my own particular narrow bubble of cultural conversation that I pay attention to. And, it raises a question that I do find intriguing, which is what is the effect on culture and art in an environment in which increasingly people's taste is both served and developed by the choices of an algorithmic software program. As always, I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We are a contemporary art rock band which blends progressive rock with aspects of post-punk and post-rock. You can check out a playlist of our best work here in the description of this video. You will have to probably seek it out manually because the algorithm doesn't seem to serve it to too many people. Or you can find us on Bandcamp or your favorite streaming service. So Chayka's thesis, as the title states, is that the algorithmic distribution of culture has a flattening effect, by which he means that algorithmic selection, whether that's an automatically generated Spotify playlist or the recommendations of Netflix or, an infinite TikTok feed, those tend to push everything toward a generic, homogenized sameness, right? And to promote the most mundane and the least challenging version of that thing. He frames this in fairly dramatic terms. He calls this filter world, and he describes filter world as something whose, quoting here, slick sameness can induce a breathtaking, near debilitating sense of anxiety, to which our natural reaction is to seek out culture that embraces nothingness, that blankets and soothes rather than challenges and surprises, as powerful artwork is meant to do. Now, Chayka's book covers a lot of different realms of culture, some of which are of more interest to me than others, some of which I know more about. There's quite a lot of stuff about how Instagram has led every coffee shop in the world to basically look the same, which is interesting, but not something that, honestly, I have that much passion for, right? There's some stuff about, the world of influencers, which is, I don't know how algorithms can really flatten that world when they kind of already, came into being at the same time. What I'm more interested in is the particular effect that it's had on music, right? The effect that it's had on the nature of music for almost everyone to get all their music through a few streaming portals, which are basically identical and interchangeable versions of each other, right? Kind of heads of the same hydra. Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, YouTube, those are, they have kind of different surfaces, but in practice, they're, essentially the same thing in terms of user experience and how they affect your experience of the music, right? And those platforms interchangeably, really, increasingly, play a role not just in supplying what people already know they're going to want to listen to, but also determining what people do listen to. Now, Chayka has some valid points, but I think it's easy to oversimplify the effect that these algorithmic devices are having, and probably to make that effect seem more singular than it really is. There are obvious anecdotal ways in which streaming has promoted unchallenging and uncreative music. We've heard a lot in the last few years about how Spotify promotes playlists which are designed to serve as background music for various kinds of situations or activities, and those playlists are often full of music which doesn't really seem to have much of a personality or a reason for existing outside of being on, Spotify's afternoon rainy day dishwashing playlist. But I'm not actually convinced that people are using music as undistinguished background in that much more widespread or pernicious a way than they did 30 years ago. I spent my whole adolescence and much of my adulthood with classic rock radio or other sorts of unchallenging FM stations playing in the background at home and in the car and in a lot of my workplaces. And, most of the time it was barely noticed white noise for most of the people around me. Even if the underlying material was better, it was both familiar enough and background enough that it really didn't connect with people any more than the kind of Spotify activity playlists do. I think any culture can become, as Chayka says, culture that, quote, embraces nothingness and blankets and soothes, if you repeat it enough in a mundane enough context, right? It took me years and years to figure out how powerful a songwriter Tom Petty is, right? Because like I spent the first 30 years of my life with his work as this kind of hyper-familiar, unchallenging wallpaper, thanks to FM radio. And we've had music that was explicitly designed as wallpaper since the 70s, right? Since, Muzak or Music for Airports, if you want to look at the more or less highbrow versions of that concept. All these channels that are streaming infinite feeds of lo-fi hip-hop aren't really doing anything conceptually different from the many, many CDs of bland, undistinguished new age music that were, made to play at massage parlors and meditation retreats in the 80s and 90s. Chayka also talks about how streaming and algorithms make attention numerically quantifiable, right? Because they're on a platform where you have likes and plays and all these things where it's easy to see in a very concrete, particular way how much attention something is getting, right? So they make that kind of quantifiable attention the only metric by which culture can be judged, and the feedback loops that are created by that metric encourage, again in Chayka's words, a reduction into simplicity. The least ambiguous, least disruptive, and perhaps least meaningful pieces of culture are promoted the most. The thing is, there's always been a metric by which artistic success or cultural success can be judged. It's called money, right? And the influence of money has always promoted the reduction into simplicity. I don't necessarily know that the algorithm is doing anything particularly different from what the whole kind of capitalist artistic industrial complex did for, much longer than I've been alive. One of the most interesting examples in the book has to do with the band Galaxy 500, who wrote what they meant to be a deliberately pedestrian and cliched and vapid rock song, buried it near the end of what was otherwise a much artsier and more ambitious album, and then found that due to algorithmic promotion, it became far and away their most popular song on Spotify. But that's actually not a surprising turn of events, right? Because tons and tons of artists have, to one extent or another, been known for one or two unrepresentative singles which present a distorted and dumbed down view of what's actually a rich body of work. So by picking out the dumbest, most accessible Galaxy 500 song and putting it in front of the ears of the greatest number of people, what the algorithm has really done is just replicate and automate a process that record labels and FM radio and A&R people and MTV were doing through more laborious human effort for basically the whole history of recorded music. I guess MTV wasn't doing it for the whole history of recorded music, technically, but you know what I mean. And it just seems tricky to me conceptually to tell the difference between what the algorithm wants and what people want, right? If you're a YouTube creator, you hear a lot that you're supposed to put a photo of yourself in your YouTube thumbnail because the algorithm likes that. I've probably done that with the thumbnail for this video. But my understanding is that YouTube isn't somehow, detecting thumbnails that include the creator's face and promoting those automatically, right? What's happening is that people see the creator's face in the thumbnail, they take that as a sign that that video is less likely to be, bullshit, right? That some greater amount of effort and thought might have gone into it. And that makes them more likely to click on that video. So if some small initial audience sees that thumbnail, some small initial test audience clicks on that video because the thumbnail suggests a greater amount of effort, because that's what it means to people for there to be a creator's face in the thumbnail, that gets then shown to more people, right? So the algorithm is not arbitrarily preferring thumbnail with creator's face, right? People are more likely to choose that, and the algorithm magnifies the effect of that choice. At least that is my understanding of that process. This is something that I don't pay attention to as much as I should as a YouTube creator, frankly. So, on the one hand, I think that algorithmic distribution, I'm not necessarily sure that that's doing anything that different from what normal commercial pressures have done to music for, certainly longer than my own living memory. And I should admit here, too, and it pains me to say this because I do, of course, have a strong and well-documented disdain for Spotify and anything connected to it. But, if you're someone who does want to explore more esoteric forms of music, Or if you already like something obscure and you want to find more that is like that obscure thing, then the Spotify algorithm, the YouTube algorithm, those are pretty good ways to do that, right? Certainly a much better way to do it than FM radio or MTV ever were, right? FM radio, MTV, A&R Men, those all had the effect of the same kind of flattening, reduction, simplifying that the algorithm probably does, but they did not have the inverse effect of, in some cases, helping people find more interesting and thoughtful things and match, truly adventurous preferences. I recently had an argument with a friend where I was probably way too much of a sour Luddite prick about this, and I have to admit that, it does have that, the algorithm does have that benefit, and it has done a lot to connect people with things that they've ended up enjoying, to bring some amount of exposure and fan base to very obscure artists who might not otherwise have had it. I have not turned out to be one of those artists, but I've been told that it's happened to some people. And, it's done those in ways which transcend limits of location and national origin that might once have been a bigger obstacle. That being said, I still can't let go of the idea that it's fundamentally kind of boring and lame to be exposed to your favorite music through a mathematical formula, right? It's a way of taking interest and surprise and that sense of kismet out of artistic discovery. And this is something that Chayka talks about in a very effective way, a very affecting way, one of the parts of the book that I enjoyed the most. It felt more poignant to read this at a time when, for instance, Pitchfork just shut down, right? The options for finding things through traditional tastemakers, gatekeepers, critics, curators, those are either narrowed or narrowing. There's very little meaningfully independent radio anymore. Where I live, there's one college station that sometimes plays interesting things, and that's, the only way that you're going to get anything good from the radio. Most places don't even have that. I just happen to live in a college town. Media in general is in contraction. The very idea of being a professional music critic is fairly close to dead. There are fewer physical music stores where you might go to browse or get an interesting recommendation. People just generally have less social contact and fewer friends. A lot of stuff that's very powerful to me has come from, going over to a friend's house and digging through their record collection, or from, somebody calling me about a weird thing that they heard on the radio. And that's, you know, as people's social circles and social interactions narrow, there's less of that, right? And all of those trends are, to some arguable extent, a consequence of streaming media, right? Among many other things. And it feels kind of gross to me to turn the curation of my taste over to the Spotify algorithm, even as it vampirically sucks dry everything else that might be used to curate taste. And yet, there's so much now. How the hell else do we sort through all this shit? I don't know. I don't have clear answers. I suspect if anything is, structurally causing an incentivization toward bland music, part of it probably might be the way that there's an infinite well of stuff, right? And that's another point that Chayka makes that I heartily agree with, right? That the infinite well of things, the kind of, the endless trough that we all have, does make it much more difficult for people to push themselves to stick with something, to stick with something long enough to connect with it or understand it, if it is a little bit more dry, a little bit more esoteric, a little bit more challenging. I guess the best that we can do as individuals is try to maintain the part of ourselves that is able and willing to approach complicated and challenging work, to consciously maintain different avenues and channels to find things, while also acknowledging the value for new tools like, Spotify automatic playlists, to discover and transmit art, not allowing those things to eclipse every other way of being or interacting or finding. Obviously, all that's easier said than done. Thanks very much for listening. I'll see everyone next week.